Good morning. I'm Tim Sheehy, President of the Metropolitan Milwaukee Association of Commerce, and welcome back to our weekly webcast from 11 to 12 on Tuesdays. This webcast is powered by Aurora WDC, a Madison-based market and intelligence firm. They help us make faster and smarter decisions. For more, visit them at aurorawdc.com. Our goal is to provide you with actionable insights to navigate the COVID crisis as we move to the next normal. But before I introduce our two guests, here's a quick tip from Mike Maltesta, President of ERC Midwest, providing decontamination and disinfection services. CDC guidance recommends a two-step process to eliminate COVID-19 from your workplace. Step 1. Clean and remove dirt and impurities. This does not kill the coronavirus, but makes step 2 optimal. Step 2 is to disinfect using chemicals, for example, EPA registered disinfectants that will quickly kill the coronavirus germs on hard and soft surfaces. Done correctly, this two-step process applied by properly protected and trained personnel is best practice for killing the virus in your facility and returning peace of mind to your workforce. Thanks, Mike, and thanks, ERC Midwest. Now let's turn to our guests as we help you navigate the health and economic impact of COVID-19. We're joined by Dr. John Raymond, President of the Medical College of Wisconsin, and Jonas Prising, Chairman and CEO of ManpowerGroup and Chair of the MMAC. We'll start with a health update from Dr. Raymond. Dr. Raymond?
Thanks, Tim, and good morning, everyone. Over the last 3 weeks, we've been tracking the efforts of Wisconsin and the Milwaukee region to flatten the COVID-19 curve, and we've seen steady improvement in that the daily growth rate of new COVID-19 cases and in the calculated doubling rate. A favorable trend continued through 2:30 yesterday afternoon, the last data set available, which you have before you. At that time, there were 33 new COVID-19 positive tests in Milwaukee and 87 in Wisconsin. The daily growth rates improved to 8.8% in Milwaukee and 9% in Wisconsin. Recall that 3 weeks ago, the growth rate was nearly 35%. The doubling rates also improved again to 7.9 days in Milwaukee and 7.7 days in Wisconsin. And 3 weeks ago, the doubling rate was faster than every 3 days. So in terms of what we've done to flatten the curve, Wisconsin ranks in the top 10 states in our country. And I'm grateful for the tremendous work that's been done and the many sacrifices that have been made by all of us to help to flatten the curve. Now, because it appears that we're stabilizing the spread of COVID-19 in our state, we can begin to have discussions about when and how to responsibly restart sectors of our economy. But those discussions need to be driven by data, science, and metrics, and not by rhetoric. The social distancing that we've done has saved lives, but we cannot yet declare victory. As others have said before me, the COVID-19 pandemic is like a forest fire. Although we're beginning to contain that fire, all it will take is a stray ember to ignite it again. So we need to acknowledge that when we loosen some of the social distancing restrictions, there will be increases in new cases. We need to be prepared to deal with that increase and also to avoid an overwhelming surge that would set back both the healthcare and the economic sectors. We need to strike the right balance. Next slide, please. There's an ongoing national discussion about what's needed for a measured and responsible restart of our economy. This slide shows some of the preliminary consensus indicators for your consideration. First, we need to see a sustained reduction of new cases for at least 2 weeks. And we recommend that that clock should start no sooner than this past Sunday, April 12th, due to concerns about relaxed social distancing over the religious holidays this past weekend. Second, we need to be able, at a bare minimum, to test all people with COVID-19 symptoms. And I emphasize that this is a minimum standard, and I certainly hope that we can do better than that. Third, hospitals need to be able to treat all patients requiring hospitalization without resorting to the current crisis standards that we're enduring. And fourth, we must have adequate personal protective equipment available for healthcare workers, first responders, and the workers in the reopened sectors of our economy. And fifth, we must be able to count, trace, and monitor COVID-19 cases and their contacts in real time. This will require an investment in more resources for our public health sector. So from my perspective, we have very much more work and planning to do before we can begin to open the economy in a phased and responsible manner. On the other hand, these 5 metrics give us goals to focus upon. Next slide, please. Interestingly, yesterday, the World Health Organization released a list of 6 criteria for a country to lift their lockdown. Those criteria are very similar to our 5 proposed health and safety indicators that we showed you on the previous slide. WHO's guidance for countries to lift lockdowns includes 6 essential criteria. These are that the transmission of COVID-19 is controlled, that health systems can detect, test, isolate, and treat cases and trace contacts, that outbreaks have been minimized in health facilities, prisons, homeless shelters, and retirement villages, and that preventative measures are in place in workplaces, shops, and schools, and that importation risks are minimized. And for us, I think that also applies to the risk posed by other states, and that communities are educated, engaged, and empowered to adjust to a new normal. Next slide, please. This slide shows our proposed checklist for a smart restart of our economy. The checklist would include all the key health and safety indicators being green and a phased reopening that starts with low-risk sectors of the economy. We need to identify and socialize health and safety best practices for each sector of the economy, recognizing that those may be different, and to educate our workforce and to prepare them with the tools that they need to safely reopen. And we need to prepare for and develop contingency plans for flare-ups of COVID-19 as a restart begins, because there will be flare-ups. The COVID-19 virus will continue to silently stalk the human race, looking for opportunity in any lapse of our vigilance. Now, all of this will require thoughtful and deep collaboration amongst our business leaders, our government, the health systems, and our public health leaders. Next slide, please. And as a final reminder, we all must continue to practice voluntary social distancing for the foreseeable future until such a time as we've extinguished COVID-19 completely or until we have an effective vaccine or preventative treatment. This sign from a USPS building in Massachusetts, I believe, says it all. So thank you all for your leadership and collaboration. And now I'll turn it back over to Tim.
Dr. Raymond, thank you very much. As we bring Jonas in for the next segment, just a quick summary. We've seen impressive results. We're moving in the right direction. As you know, we're not out of the woods. And as we start to restart our economy, it's going to be incumbent upon employers really to pick up the mantle here and drive workplace safety for themselves, their employees, and their customers. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, very well said.
Good, thank you. I know you're going to stick around and we'll have lots of questions that we're going to pull from our listeners and viewers. But let me turn now to Jonas Prising, the chairman and CEO of ManpowerGroup, who joins us. Manpower does business in over 80 countries. I know, Jonas, you've already been on the phone this morning with some of your colleagues from Europe. And this gives you a unique perspective on the impact of COVID on your customers and your employees. And so what I'd like to do is kind of take that perspective and break it down in some bite-sized questions as we walk through your experience with the impact on COVID, literally all over the globe. So let me start with this. When did the COVID-19 appear on your leadership screen as a serious issue?
I would say, Tim, that, so first of all, thank you for inviting me to join the webinar today. And I would say the first time we talked about it as a global leadership team was probably sometime end of January. And the first time we really saw some of the impact was when we reviewed the situation in Asia Pacific middle of February. So that's when it really rose to the top of our monitoring and activity list. So mid-February is when we could really start to see the countries adjusting to the impact of the shutdown and the lockdown in China, and how that then spread very, very quickly across the Asia Pacific region, with a big impact in that region at the time.
So describe to me, as you kind of saw this rolling impact across the different markets that you work in, what's been the impact and the reaction from your customers?
Well, the difference between what we've seen in many different economic cycles over decades here was the magnitude and the speed with which countries reacted in terms of restricting travel, restricting mobility of their citizens, and others have visited the countries. So very quickly you had an impact on the industries that both relied on China as part of the supply chain, because it was restricted to some degree. Many countries rely extensively on Chinese tourism. I don't know if you've traveled over the world over the last 5 or 6 years, you can't but help notice the massive amounts of Chinese tourists that are coming. Well, that dried up overnight. Within 36 hours, the hotel occupancy dropped in many of the most popular tourist destinations in Asia from a 70–80% occupancy rate to 20% within a week. And so that clearly had a massive impact on the hospitality sector and all of the services sectors, and then eventually started to make its way into some of the manufacturing sector as well.
And then, as you've seen this impact your customers, you've got employees all over the world. Talk about how that how the impact has hit your employees in different countries.
So we've really seen this wave, go through first Asia, and then, of course, as you well know, all of the evolution we saw across Europe, starting with Italy and then Spain, now France, and UK, which is probably the laggard in that region, then move over to North America. So I would say we were fortunate in some ways that the first wave hit Asia. And I say that because in Asia, we have very robust crisis mitigation and management plans. You say, why Asia? Well, we've had SARS, MERS, and the tsunami. So our ability to very quickly track and trace all of our people in the face of natural disasters and earthquakes in Japan and all of those things really enabled us to very quickly put those plans into place and make sure that we kept our people safe and healthy. Which for the most part meant they had to go and start to work remote and not come into the office. They couldn't travel within the region as they are accustomed to. But we were able to activate that very quickly and use our coding system. So we use coding systems, not very innovative, but it's green, yellow, orange, and red. And we monitor the progression of each operations environment along that scale, so we know what to do when it moves from orange or yellow to orange and from orange to red. And we very quickly moved, from yellow to orange, and then it took a while, but then most of the countries then moved into red, and that's where they are today, which is really a full-on risk mitigation plan that we've activated. So within a very short period of time, 90% of our people moved from working in the offices to working remotely from home. We had made technology investments that enabled remote and virtual working for our people, both from a back office perspective and a front office perspective. But I would say a lot of those learnings and what we saw happening in Asia also gave us time to prepare for exactly the same wave to go through. We didn't know exactly when and how and where it would start first, but we believed it was going to come. And of course, here in the US and North America, and the last countries and the parts of the world that haven't really seen it hit yet, Latin America and parts of Africa, are the ones where we've taken those best practices. We've made sure we have the same mitigation strategies in place. So the employees world changed very, very quickly, but luckily where it hit us first, we had very robust emergency management plans, and we activated those quickly, and then we learned from what worked and what didn't work, and we then moved on and implemented those across Europe and here in the US as well.
Can you also share with us, Jonas, you and I have had this discussion about the interesting differences and nuances by country based on the culture of the country and the makeup of their government in terms of how they're both reacting and addressing this crisis?
Yeah, no, so it's really interesting, and it's a great question, that we think about, because we see all of these versions of lockdowns, no lockdowns, soft lockdowns, and in the end, this whole crisis is all about people. It's about people getting sick, and then not us trying to, and society trying to do everything they can to avoid overwhelming the healthcare system. But ultimately, it's also about what do people do? How do they react in the face of this crisis? And you have examples, of course, such as China with a complete lockdown in Wuhan, but the rest of China actually stayed reasonably open, but with very, very severe social distancing restrictions and people staying in their houses for a long time. Korea basically doesn't have any lockdown measures except in one part of Korea. For the rest, life goes on reasonably unrestricted. You read a lot about Sweden, in terms of the social, what the lack of rules. What the restaurants are open, the schools are open, many things are open. But speaking to my colleagues in Sweden earlier this morning, 80% restaurant business is down by 80%. Why? Because the population is heeding the call to action and doing the things that Dr. Raymond talked about earlier, which is practicing extreme social distancing. So the fact that the restaurants are open and that activity on the face of it is much more open than in many of the lockdown countries that we see, France being the most extreme, maybe closely followed by Italy and Spain. In the end, it's what the population does with the information that it has and the culture of listening to the facts and the science and the advice of government and, changing the behavior accordingly. So, all restaurants are open in Sweden, yet restaurant visits are down by 80%. So when we read the news about Sweden and saying it's a big social experiment, to some degree it might be, but the reality is the culture of Sweden is, the adherence to government advice is very high, and the level of what is socially acceptable to the society and adherence to that is also very high. So when the government says, hey, the restaurants are open, but we really don't think it's a good idea to go out and mingle with friends and people in a restaurant environment, 80% of the people don't do it. So that in the end appears to be the biggest determinant on whether the countries are successful at flattening the curve. Italy implemented pretty quickly rigorous restrictions, which were promptly not adhered to by virtually anyone. And that's why you saw the continued explosion. And then in the end, society came in and really understood that they needed to practice social distancing and do it. But of course, the damage to the economy at that point was very significant. But I have to say, a lot of the cultural aspects and how you communicate this in a way that doesn't alarm the population, but the citizens know what is good and what's going to get us out of this faster, and doing that effectively appears to frankly be an even greater determinant of the success at flattening this famous curve than the degree and the severity of the lockdown in itself.
And we've also talked about some of the nuances, Jonas, about I hear people, contact me and say, look, China's back to doing business as normal. Can you explain a little bit from your perspective what that business as normal looks like?
Well, I think, when we think about the emergence of this, and I think Dr. Raymond, spoke very eloquently and has a great, sort of checklist of things that need to be met so that you can think about reopening it. But in all cases, and all of the things you read about in the papers about Europe opening, and the things that we now see, when we say China is back to business, it just means some of the severe lockdown measures have been relaxed. But let's be clear, everyone in every interaction is wearing face masks. All the restaurants are operating at 50 to 80% less capacity than what they had before. Why? They have spacing. They have a limited number of patrons that can come in. And in some cases, they've had to build glass booths around the table so that you don't have the possibility of the virus easily transmitting again in the kinds of businesses that are really contact and socially intensive, which would be a good breeding ground for the virus to come back. So when we are thinking about back to normal, even in those countries that are getting out of it, it's a very different new normal than what we saw and what we think of as normal 3 or 4 months ago, or in our case, just a month ago. So the social interactions are different. The companies that are operating, not in the hospitality sector, but the companies that are running their businesses are running it in a completely different way. They're taking people's temperatures when they come in, during lunch break, and when they leave. They are staggering shifts. They're moving production lines, so you have enough distance between the two. They disinfect between shifts and sometimes during the shifts as well. So they're applying extreme cleaning procedures in between. And many of the companies are actually still not allowing their employees to go back to the office, even though the lockdown measures themselves have been released, because they can operate their business without having everybody in the office, and they want to mitigate the risk to their employees and to their business. So they're only allowing fewer employees to come into the office, and in some cases you have 2 shifts. The first part of the week you have half of the office coming in, or a quarter of the office coming in. The next, and for the rest of the week they work from home, and then you have the new crew coming in, preferably and many times sitting in different parts of the building, so you don't have the infection risk, because they all know and expect that there are going to be flare-ups. They just don't want to be the source of that flare-up. So the new normal, when people are starting to come back, looks extremely different from what it used to be before the virus struck.
Very interesting. And as we talk about the new normal, and you look at your business and the world of work and the future of work, what's going to return to normal, and what do you see as new, at least in the next couple of years?
It's something you read about a lot in the papers, and whenever you have technology or situations like this creating completely new environments, a lot of the rhetoric goes around a massive pendulum swing to we're all going to be working from home. And I don't think that's going to be the case. But I do believe that what will have all discovered is that we are able to get a lot more done leveraging technology tools. So this should enable organizations, and above all, individuals and employees, to have more flexible work arrangements and being confident that the work can get done. So whilst I don't think that we're all going to see a huge wave of remote working for many businesses, because people want to and like to engage socially, and knowledge work in particular, and of course manufacturing specifically, requires people to be working together at close proximity. But it is going to mean that we're going to be seeing the evolution and becoming much more flexible in terms of how we're thinking about our workforce and how often they would be in the office versus not. So I think that is something that's going to continue. Certainly the evolution of e-commerce is going to be, accelerated. But having said that, we've also seen the limitations of e-commerce, and I'm pretty sure that when all of this is over, all of us will look forward to going into department stores and other places to look at some of the materials and interact in a more physical way with the goods and services that we want to buy. So I think some of the things will change. The advent of technology and its impact on the workplace is going to accelerate for sure, but many other things are going to go back to the way they were before, because in the end, the greatest driver of societal change in the case of technology is not what it can do, but it's what people want it to do. And as much as people want to leverage and have more flexibility in how they structure their work, and their employees can now accept that, the employers can accept it, their preference in many cases will be what determines what the outcome is. And therefore, I think some of the changes we can predict, others are not easy to predict. But many of the things that we liked doing before the pandemic, we're going to like doing when we come back and we get through all of this crisis again.
Yeah. So Jonas, bringing kind of this experience closer to home, when you look at Wisconsin's reaction, A, what do you think about it? And then B, when you think about your own operations here in Wisconsin, how do you look at those coming back into the new normal?
So first of all, I would say as a business community and healthcare community, and the government and various actors working together, I think we rank very high here in Wisconsin. We're in the top 10 in the nation in terms of our ability to implement measures that encourage social distancing, moving towards a situation where we're starting to see the very encouraging signs that Dr. Raymond showed us in his weekly update just a few minutes ago. So it is a very encouraging sign to me, and I say that because going back to the early part of our conversation, Tim, if the greatest determinant of how we manage a situation like this is the culture and the discipline of the citizens when they are faced with a situation like this, that's a great place to be in as we think about the next phases of coming back. Because once the time has passed and once the kind of conditions that Dr. Raymond mentioned earlier, the science tells us when it's safer to go back to work, we all know we're not going to go back to work the way it was before. So we're going to be having to implement social distancing techniques within our workplace, as well as continue them as individuals in our personal lives. We'll have to organize our businesses in a different way, so we reduce the social interaction to the greatest degree possible, so we don't have uncontrolled flares, but rather flares that we can test and trace and track and quarantine so it doesn't spread again. All of that requires discipline and understanding from the population and a willingness to actually do it. And based on what we have seen and the reaction of the state and under the governor's leadership, I think, which has also been good in the areas that we have had to implement and the speed with which we implemented, I think, as we think forward about preparing to return safely to work and resume our normal lives, taking those steps, I think we should be very, very well placed based on, how we've handled these last 4 weeks. And in terms of how we're thinking about returning the business, it's really, the first step are exactly the kinds of steps that we want to be knowing as we look at the data and make sure that from a healthcare perspective, now is a time where we can think about it. Then, so that we are sure that when we ask our people to go back to work, that they can go back to work, in the locations, and that they will be safe to do so. We will then also be looking at providing PPE equipment. Of course, the first priority goes to the first responders and making sure that anybody within the healthcare system and essential workers have them. We believe a lot of our people will want to have, the feeling of safety coming to work. So that means we'll have to make sure that we have materials available for them as well. But I also think that, frankly, we will be easing into this by having staggered shifts. We won't have everybody, come back whenever the time is that we feel it's ready to come back. We will be one of the companies, I believe, that will refrain from taking everybody back on day one, because we can actually run our business virtually in many parts of the world, including here in the US and including here in Wisconsin. And we would refrain from bringing our people back so that we are part of the solution that has less contact. We limit the social contacts on our side as much as possible, so that others that can't do that are able to step in and start their activities back up again. So that's how we're thinking about it at this point, Tim.
Very, very helpful. Dr. Raymond, I'm going to bring you back in. We've got a lot of questions from the audience, and would like both you and Jonas to tackle the questions. So the first one is kind of maybe from a business perspective, and then, and not that they're divorced, and then Dr. Raymond from a health perspective. Given current trends in Wisconsin, do you think businesses can open back up by Memorial Day?
I would say that it's all going to be down to the data. It's all going to depend on where we are. This hiccup that Dr. Raymond referred to earlier in terms of the social congregations that happened over the weekend and maybe the election. I'm hoping that there's not a flare-up, and it's really all going to be down to, is the situation controllable from a healthcare perspective, and I don't know that there is a specific date that one can lock into now, because it'll all depend on the data. But what I do know, though, and which we're preparing for, are really, as businesses, to think about, okay, we're coming out of this at one point in time. How can we get ready for that time? So what are the social distancing practices that we want to implement in our organization? How would we gradually bring people back to work? What kind of equipment would they need to feel comfortable coming back to work, so that we can assure them that when we ask you to come back into the office, you will be safe and you will remain healthy by doing so, and that we're taking the protective measures around that. What are the business practices that we need to prepare for, so that when we interact with our clients and our associates, we can do that in a safe way? So until such time that we're actually seeing that we can start to do it, we're going to spend all of this time preparing and being very ready for whatever processes and adjustments we need to make in our business to be ready to go, and then adhere to that. And I think that's what we as businesses can do, between the time where we can now start to see the end at the light, or the light at the end of the tunnel, and actually getting there, is to be prepared. Because the beauty of how this can work is, if we as businesses and employers with our employees are disciplined when we return safely to work, we will be able to reduce the risk of the flare-ups and reduce the risk of contagion. And so we'll be contributing to making sure that we can stay on track and keep getting back to business. Because when government intervenes and lockdowns occur, it's a blunt instrument that hits indiscriminately across all sectors. And some of our businesses in the state and in the country, and frankly globally, are suffering greatly, as you can see from the unemployment numbers and the rapid rise of unemployment in many parts of the world, and here in Wisconsin as well. So, to get out of this, it's going to be incumbent upon us as businesses to be very disciplined and be very clear about what it is that we need to do, how we can contribute to the solution. Because that way, when we show that we make progress in that way, we won't need to have government interventions or state interventions. We will be able to manage this and be self-determinant about the outcomes. And I think that's exactly the situation we want to be in, because not all industries are the same. Not all businesses are the same. And if we can tailor make it to one size fits one, but we all have the same objective of reducing the risk of infections, we'll be ready to go back when the data tells us that we're able to do so.
And I want to compliment you both right now for your leadership, Jonas, in terms of running the MMAC, and Dr. Raymond running the medical college. And I know that your leadership is going to help us prepare the business community with, for lack of a better word, a good housekeeping seal, a kind of safe at work, so companies can share best and next practices as they come back into the next normal. And I think that's going to be very valuable for the business community as a whole. Dr. Raymond's question here about, given the shortage of testing, how reliable are the doubling and growth data?
Very good question. I think the precision probably isn't as important as the trend, and we've seen positive trends for quite some time, and we have not exceeded the capacity of our health systems to deliver the best care to everybody who needs it right now. And so what I would say is that was a good surrogate measure up to this point. We're probably going to need to start pivoting and focusing on some more specific indicators for the health and safety metrics that we talked about. So it'll be good to follow these for a while, but I think what we can say is we did what we could to bend down the curve. We bent it down enough that we, at least for now, have avoided a surge that exceeded our capacity. But we probably need to start focusing on some other metrics.
Another question, Dr. Raymond, and then Jonas, maybe you can chime in with your experience in France here. Will the N95 masks eventually be made available to workers, or will they continue to be reserved for our healthcare workers?
Well, I hope the healthcare workers get them first, but I recognize there may be a need for others, especially in certain sectors of the economy where that would make sense. So Jonas probably has a better idea of whether that's feasible or not.
Well, I would say that, of course, the priority is to make sure that all of the first responders and the healthcare workers get all of the PPE that they need to do their job and keep us all safe and healthy. As we think about this in the business, and in France in particular, as you might have seen, they are instituting requirements to go back to work that require employers to provide PPE to a degree. And those are not N95 masks. They are, surgical masks that have lesser, blocking capability, I guess. And they are there to prevent the spread and the most immediate exposure to this. But I think a lot of this, in the end, is about employer confidence in the measures that employee confidence, in citizen confidence, and what it takes to safely get back to work. The issue in France, as you might have noticed, is a very severe lockdown and very restrictive measures. I mean, fines of thousands of dollars if you have a garden party, and if you're out walking and it turns out that you were somebody who doesn't live in your household, you'll be fined thousands of dollars, and that's keeping people off the streets. But in the end, what it's also done, it scared the population. So no one dares to go out and no one dares to go back to work. And that's a situation I think that we will want to avoid to the greatest degree possible, of course, because we need to give consumers, we need to give our employees the confidence that they can return to work. And as part of that, I believe that some form of face protection may be one of those confidence building measures that we can explain isn't a solution to all of it, and there are other measures you have to take. But we're thinking about looking at some of that equipment as a way of giving confidence to our people and providing them with some extra protection on top of the social distancing measures that, of course, we're going to be applying. But again, these are not N95 masks, and the first priority certainly goes to all of the first responders and the healthcare professionals that need them much, much more.
Yeah. Dr. Raymonds, what's the source of the Medical College of Wisconsin dashboard data?
Good question. We have looked in the literature. We've consulted with experts that we know from across the country, and we just tried to use good common sense about what is it that we must have to feel like we can safely restart. And I believe that the recommendations that we're putting forward are pretty consistent with what people are thinking about in other countries. And again, I just highlight the World Health Organization recommendations that came out yesterday are very similar to the ones that we proposed.
So one more question for you, Dr. Raymond, again. UVC sanitizing lights being used in the medical field, are they effective against COVID?
Certain wavelengths might be, but I'm not an expert on UV light. I know that there are protocols for sterilizing N95 masks that use UV or hydrogen peroxide, and that those have been validated as effective. So I think there might be a role for UV light.
Jonas, kind of in the midst of this COVID pandemic here, what demand is Manpower seeing for upskilling and adult continuing education programs?
We're actually seeing a great deal of interest, especially from people that have been furloughed, that really can't be deployed productively back into their organizations. And we're seeing an uptick in demand for reskilling and upskilling initiatives based on the individual's desire to use this time to actually increase their skill sets. And I think it's important to remember that when we get out of the crisis, all of the structural changes in the workforce that we've seen in terms of the need for a more skilled workforce, the demographic trends that are driving skills shortages, all of those trends are going to continue. Now, whether it takes 9 months for us to get out of this or 18 months, over time, all of the same structural drivers are going to be prevalent and be very visible in the labor market. So in this situation, we're seeing individuals really taking their initiative and using this time to upskill and reskill on their own. But we believe that exactly the same need for employers and employees to engage in this at a large scale is going to continue to be very, very important once we get through this pandemic and the ensuing economic downturn, and even during the downturn, to really think about how we can do reskilling and upskilling at scale for our workforce.
Jonas, both you and Dr. Raymond have talked about the data and following the data. And Dr. Raymond, we've had this discussion kind of using the University of Washington data about where Wisconsin is, and now having kind of more what you would call real-time Wisconsin data to inform us of where we're going. So again, how would you look at the pivot from using this third-party data, Wisconsin data, and what does that mean for a better ability for Wisconsin to look at a date when it can reopen its businesses?
I think first, we all recognize that the models have flaws because you need to make assumptions, and this is a new disease, the behavior of which we're learning about every single day. And especially with the IHME or the University of Washington model that people are following so closely, there were dramatic improvements, I think, in the assumptions that they made going forward. What I'd like to see is converting those models of predicting the impact during a surge of COVID-19 to try to predict the impact of relaxation of social distancing so that we can plan for whatever might be happening with whatever restrictions that we loosen up. I can tell you that I think it's important that we use local data and that we use local experts as well. And we do have a team at the Medical College of Wisconsin who are trying to do some predictive modeling. We'd love to work with our colleagues at UW and across the academic and business sectors so that we have a useful tool going forward.
Let me ask you both this question. There's a lot of pent-up demand or tension in terms of managing these curves here in Wisconsin, delivering enough of a response that we flatten the healthcare curve and making sure that we don't flatten the economic curve. So as we look into this next normal, and at some point, the state's ability, their emergency powers are going to subside. And then it's going to be up to businesses, local leaders, and others to determine the right way in which we do business going forward. So how do you both look at that? Because at some point here, we aren't going to be able to look at the state government for a safer at home response. We're going to have to deliver that kind of response on our own. So I'm interested in both of your perspectives in terms of how we do that going forward.
Well, I'll start. I think Jonas said culture is important and the actions of individuals matter. And I think that's something that we really need to be thinking about. So we need to continue to educate people about what they can do to protect themselves, their loved ones, and their organizations going forward. But, you know, the state may be not necessarily able to intervene with the types of orders that we saw, but it's possible we could set up a certification process that would say that in this sector of the economy that you're exercising best and reasonable practices. And that might be an approach that the business community and government could undertake together.
Yeah, I think that is one good way of thinking about it. But you know, in the end, for us to get back to the way it was before, we will need to have a vaccine in place. So until such vaccine is available and tested and known to be effective, we're going to be living in a new normal. And you know, the experts say a vaccine could take 18 months. You know, we're 3 months in, we're 1 month in. I don't know, maybe it's a year. But so whatever we're going to be put into place is only going to work if we pull together as a community and as a business community in terms of how we try and help our employees stay safe so that they are not the source of, and we are not as businesses the source of these flare-ups, which inevitably is going to drive the growth curve out in terms of a return to good economic growth. Because I've seen a few examples of countries that had, you know, to take steps back. And psychologically, when Singapore is the champion of this, and then they have flare-ups and they have to go back, it's very difficult for the population, you know, to accept. And of course, it just stretches out the possibility for business to return back to whatever level of normal operating level and results that they would like to achieve. So it just shifts everything out. So I think it's going to be really important for us, you know, from a business perspective, to be very disciplined and very mindful of that whatever measures we put in now and the rigor and discipline that we apply is actually going to benefit us, because the worst that can happen is either blunt government instruments that, you know, cut across sectors and areas of the country or the state that are not equally affected. So I think Dr. Raymond is absolutely right. It's the more local we can be, the more effective we're going to be. and that we do it in such a way that it guarantees essentially our ability to return to the normal business activity as quickly as possible. So I think the responsibility and the opportunity that we have as businesses to show the way of how to return safely is one that I think we should embrace, because that way we can control our own destiny and we can be part of the solution and making sure that we get back on the economic growth curve as quickly as possible. Because not doing that and just letting everything open up in an uncontrolled way for sure would necessitate a big step back. And that would just, not so much, and when I say step back, it's not that I'd be worried, that the government would impose more lockdowns, because frankly, I don't think, that would work very well. But what would happen instead is that consumers would lose confidence and our employees would lose confidence. And when they lose confidence in an economy that is 70% consumer driven, they don't buy, they don't shop, they don't come out to eat, they don't engage, which means demand would drop structurally now. And now you're just creating a situation where a recessionary environment of the traditional kind would permeate, and it'd be really hard to get out of until you had the vaccine. So now we could be in a very tough spot. So it's really important for us, I think, to take practical measures that demonstrate and instill confidence in our employees, in all of our communities, that we can get safely back to work, but we'll do it in a way that minimizes the risk of having any setbacks.
Dr. Raymond, let me ask you this question, and then I'm going to ask the same question of Jonas. I got a question here from one of the viewers is, when is it safe to travel for, how will we determine when air travel for work is safe again? So I'm going to ask you, Dr. Raymond, from your perspective, and then probably the person that spends more time on a plane than anyone I know can give his response.
Really hard question. I'm going to go back to something that Jonas said. I think when we have an effective vaccine, we can think about resuming normal activities, including travel. Until then, it's a difficult question to answer, because we know that the virus can spread more than we thought at the beginning, that it's highly contagious, and that it can have serious health consequences. So I think that's going to be really a tough one. In terms of traveling around the country, I would say that I would encourage anybody that has YouTube to look at a video by Tectonics that shows the spread of people's cell phones from a Daytona Beach during spring break, and how quickly they spread across the country. We're so connected that it's really hard to think that we're not going to have an impact on each other if we travel even a little bit.
I would agree. I think it's very hard to say when, but I do think the how is going to change fundamentally for quite some time, and possibly all the way until we get the virus. So we're going to think about travel as essential versus non-essential, and I think we will filter that pretty heavily, full well knowing some of the data that John talked about in terms of the spread, and that really most of the spread that is reoccurring in countries that have sort of passed the first wave in Asia are all due to travelers coming in. And I think the reality is many of the countries will hold on to their travel restriction almost longer than anything else. They'll open restaurants and schools and local businesses, and commercial goods traffic will occur. But until such time that they're very confident that a large number of people coming from outside a controlled environment into their country are either not tested and or quarantined in a sufficient way, I think we'll find that travel is going to take a long time to recover to the levels that it's been before, because many countries will continue to restrict travel, I believe, extensively, until they're very sure that they could control the flow of people coming into a region. And that's the other reason why I think it's so important. You've now seen governors on both sides of the coast, and I think our own governor is doing the same, trying to collaborate with multiple states surrounding Wisconsin so that we can coordinate returning safely back to work with our adjacent and neighboring states, because there's no point in trying to do something in Wisconsin if our neighboring states are off doing something completely different that could really ease the infection rates and have them come into our state from somewhere else.
Yeah, so I take that, Jonas, you don't look forward to getting caught 14 days in a quarantine hotel somewhere in the world.
No, I think that's what would happen. I mean, you don't want to risk going to China or to Japan or to, Austria, and they welcome you, and then they say, but unfortunately the rules changed, and 14 days in a hotel room at the airport is where you're going to be sitting until we'll let you go out and do your business meeting. So I'll monitor that very, very closely, and frankly, the way we use technology like this is going to be one of the big learnings for organizations, and certainly for myself, how effective you can be if you plan it and you structure it appropriately working remotely. I have to say, it's not much fun. I'd much rather sit in a room with Tim and John and have this discussion in person, but it's possible to do it and still be productive. And I think that's one of the remaining changes that we'll realize and that we'll have to continue to practice, because practically speaking, we're not going to be able to return back to the way it was until we have many things in place.
Yeah, Dr. Raymond, talking about returning back to the way things are, a question about whether college students will be able to return to their campuses in fall. So given your vantage point today, how would you address that even with your own school?
I have a lot of colleagues asking me that same question. I don't think there's a good answer. If we have widespread validated antibody or serological testing available, that may be a game changer. We're not going to have a vaccine before the fall, so that's not going to change things. We may need to use certification strategies, temperature screenings, rigorous history screenings, travel restrictions on those campuses before we can safely reopen dormitories and cafeterias. So I think it remains to be seen whether we can do that.
Jonas, question here. Major acceleration of existing labor force trends, so how do you look at the acceleration of existing labor force trends in this current environment?
Well, the trends that we saw before, which is that technology has a huge impact on how companies are changing the compositions and the skill compositions within their workforce, that is one of the things that we can think about will accelerate due to this crisis. So, the need to be able to leverage tools and technology to get more work done and productively done remotely as well as within an organization, but working in a different way. I certainly think that is one of the changes that we'll see. The one area, though, that can have a sort of a little bit of a turn here is the need for more nearshoring. In terms of, this crisis right now is a demand crisis. The economy will take a hit due to the drop in demand. But what's equally clear is for when we get started again, the supply chain vulnerability, so the globalization of the supply chain, will probably mean that we'll see more nearshoring. So getting some of the work that was done elsewhere, we might start to see that come back onshore or nearshore, so that the vulnerability of the supply chain isn't as extreme. And what that means in terms of workforce is, that this idea of, manufacturing is best done in China, and they are the world's leader in many of the manufacturing areas, that's going to change. And we could see some resurgence come back, both in the manufacturing field as well as in other fields, where we want to make sure that we have workforces capable of doing work within our own country or near shore, as opposed to a 5-week boat ride away.
Yeah. So kind of a question for both of you, Dr. Raymond's kind of healthcare question, and Jonas from an employer's perspective. As we look ahead, and Dr. Raymond's, the indicators that you would say it's safe to reopen K-12 schools before there's a vaccine. So obviously a lot of working parents are going to have kids in a K-12 environment. And how do you look at, from a health perspective, reopening the K-12 school system? And then Jonas, how do employers have to think about this now if they're going to have a different situation for their family going forward?
Yeah, again, really tough question, and it's the right one to ask. I think we're not going to have a whole lot of choice. We're eventually going to need to reopen the schools and do a controlled experiment. We'll probably have to have best practices about what we do if a child may be ill, and whether we can provide daycare and other options for working families. But I think the pressures to reopen K through 12 are a lot larger than the ones to open up the dormitories and in-person learning for the universities.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think this is probably the one area, if you look at all of the countries in Europe as well as in Asia, one of the first things that they do is open up the schools. So, Denmark is opening up the schools, so is Norway next week. So, the return for kids to go back to school frees up the parents. And I think it is one of the most urgent ones to address, and I would expect that, we will see the same here. From an employer perspective, however, what this means, though, is that we have to make it very clear to our employees that if you have somebody who falls ill in your family, don't come to work. Because the discipline around quarantining when you have individuals in close proximity to somebody who may be your child, don't send them to school and you don't have to come to work. Now, one of the benefits of having lived through this situation is we actually know that parents can work from home for some time and still be engaged in the workforce. So if they have somebody who's fallen ill at school, then you are still able to be productive. So I think as employers, we'll have to think differently about how we would have thought about this previously, because we don't want our employees to come into work when somebody in their family could have been exposed to this virus. And that's going to be something that we as employers will need to emphasize even more, and of course also facilitate for our employees and make it possible for them to do that both from a work perspective as well as from a compensation perspective, so that they don't feel they have to come in, and that they can work remotely.
So as we kind of wrap up the webcast here, Dr. Raymond, what thought do you want to leave the audience with today as we look out ahead at Wisconsin's path going forward? And then Jonas, question for you, what do you want employers to think about as we start to move into the next normal?
I see glimmers of hope, but that places the burden of responsibility squarely on all of our shoulders to get it right.
Thank you.
And I would say that, as businesses, we embrace and want to see these glimmers of hope, of course, translate into, a path to return to normal activity, but that we as businesses need to know that we shoulder probably a disproportionate responsibility in that way, because how we lead our organizations and how we lead and communicate with our employees has a tremendous impact on whether coming out of this situation is going to be successful and that we can return gradually to our normal activities. So that would be my call to action. Is I like being in control of our own destiny as a business. I'm sure many of you on this call like to be able to determine your own destiny as well, but we will all have to do it within the context that together we are going to get through this, and we have to get through it in a way that minimizes the risk for flare-ups that are going to put us off track again. So we will have to be very disciplined and very focused and collaborate in many and new ways to share best practices so that we can get back to work once the data tells us it's safe to do so in the best and the fastest way possible, but still applying a lot of social distancing techniques that are very different from how we used to run our business before this healthcare crisis.
Thank you. Dr. Raymond, President of the Medical College, Jonas Prising, Chairman and CEO of ManpowerGroup. Thank you both for your time, and Milwaukee is lucky, Wisconsin is lucky to have your leadership at this time during this crisis. We're greatly appreciate you taking the time to join the webinar today. We'll be back with you next Tuesday. And if you're interested in our healthcare update, you can tune in at 3:30 this afternoon. We'll have the latest update again. So have a safe rest of your week. Jonas, Dr. Raymond, again, thank you very much for joining.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, everyone.